Before the success stories, the progress, there was you. You who made a choice to grow, to inspire, to overcome your own challenges. At NASM, we're in service of your limitless potential because when you keep growing, we all get stronger. And we'll never stop making your journey our mission. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified personal trainer.
You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Richey, and today we're going to be talking about what's the difference. These are questions I get kind of regularly where people are like, hey, man, what's the difference between this and that? What's the difference? And I like it because I also like the idea that this is a vocabulary lesson. So it's not just something that you're sitting around and you're like, oh, let me just listen to Rick kind of passively. I'll listen and hear what he's got to say. But now you can listen and gather some vocabulary out of the lesson today, some of which you guys are already going to know, and some of which you've probably been asking, what's the difference? So let's talk about the first pair of vocabulary terms and what's the difference. We've got the term hypertrophy, which you may have heard before, and you may not know exactly what that is. And then there's another term called hyperplasia. What's the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia? Let you start thinking on it. Ding, 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 ding. Just kidding. I'm just going to go ahead and start talking about it. So hypertrophy is the growth of skeletal muscle. Hyperplasia, the difference, because we think about it, we want a hypertrophy, we want our muscles to grow. Well, hyperplasia is when the actual number of cells grow. And that doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often in our muscles. It doesn't happen very often in our fat. But it's possible that it does happen. And there's some research coming out that it may happen a little bit more than what we think. But the current consensus is that our muscles hypertrophy, the actual, you don't grow more muscles, the muscle fibers you have get bigger. So we don't tend to hyperplasia. We don't grow more muscles. We don't get more fibers. We just grow the ones. We hypertrophy the ones that currently exist. Now, it is possible that hyperplasia can take place, and they may take place during rapid times of growth. So it's possible that that takes place during hypertrophy, during puberty. But so during puberty, there may be some hyperplasia that takes place. There is the assumption by some that hyperplasia may take place with the use of anabolic steroids. So it's not just the growth of muscle, but potentially the increase in the number of muscle fibers that exist. So that is a possibility as well. But as it currently stands in our current research and what we know, hypertrophy is really the greatest, and it tends to be, no matter what, the greatest extent of what happens. Your muscles grow, they do not multiply. Don't be disappointed. Don't be sad. I'm a little sad. I kind of wish they multiplied. Strength. There are questions about strength, and I get the questions, well, what is strength? And my response generally is, it depends on what type of strength you're talking about. And we generally will cut things up into things. We'll say this is endurance, this is strength, and this is power. And yet the strength also is applied to the word endurance. So it is your endurance strength. So your strength training in the OPT model is actually a range of type of strength. So that is getting us closer to a type of strength known as max strength. So let's talk about this. So endurance strength is how many repetitions that you can do with a particular weight. That is your endurance. Your stabilization strength is how well you can stabilize while you're doing these other types of strength. Like, how well does my shoulder stay in my socket when I'm doing endurance strength, or I'm doing throws, or I'm doing max strength lifts? Now, a max strength is your 1 rep max generally, but sometimes we'll point it out and we'll say, well, what about your 3 rep max? What about your 5 rep max? But your max strength is the maximal amount of strength that you can produce, generally for smaller, fewer repetitions. And that tends to work muscles in a different way too. So as we go into max strength, there is a tendency where we are trying to get muscles that we currently have, the muscle fibers that we currently have, to engage, because we have something called the all or none principle. When I'm talking right now and I'm moving my hands around a little bit, and the muscles that are having me move my hands around, or have my mouth move while I'm talking to you, or have me blink while I'm talking to you, the muscles that are doing that are firing with absolute 100% everything that they have. So if you engage a muscle, you facilitate a muscle past the point where it will contract with everything it has, that fiber. The problem is, if I've got 5% of my fibers that can do the work, then the other 95% will not be engaged. The heavier we lift, the more we request, those dormant fibers to participate in the activity. So if we don't do max strength training ever, then we never even come close to trying to get every muscle we have to participate in the activities. So max strength training is oftentimes a neural adaptation, versus hypertrophy training, which is a cellular adaptation. We're trying to change the size of the fiber or the cell, the muscle cell. And so that is hypertrophy. It is working on that cell itself. It is a cellular adaptation, while max strength training tends to be a neural adaptation. So what's the difference? Neural adaptation, cellular adaptation. Cellular is an adaptation in the muscle where we grow the muscle. Neural is where we recruit more muscle fibers. There are also a couple other types of strength while I'm on the subject that I'd like to mention. There's one that we refer to just as functional strength. Functional strength is an old definition that NASM used to have in the textbook. It's still my favorite definition. Is the neuromusculoskeletal system's ability to produce, reduce, and dynamically stabilize in multiple planes at various speeds in a safe and coordinated fashion. Now, that's hardy. That is a meaty definition. But what's important about that is that just because you're good at endurance, or good at stabilization, or good at max strength, does that mean that you can do these exercises? Let's say squats or bench presses. Does that mean that you can take that and be better at functional strength? In a way, yes, you can become more functional, but just because you lift weights doesn't make you more functional. Weightlifting is a supplement. That's the right word, vocabulary man. So let's try that again. Strength training is a supplement for your functional strength, where you are now taking that strength that you're using and applying it to an actual player performance situation, where, you talk about tennis. Well, tennis players, there's a functional strength for them, and then you can use actual strength training exercises to support them. But I'm not a big fan of saying, well, tennis players do this move, so that's how we need to strength train. That's not necessarily true. It's just that you need to get stronger. You need to get your tennis clients and people that you work with stronger. And then they take that out to the court and they work with a skills coach that turns that into their functional capacity, their functional capability, their functional strength. There's another strength. Excuse me. I like this one, especially as a smaller person, is something called relative strength. Relative strength I like a lot, because that made me feel a lot better when I could do 15 pull-ups, but I could not necessarily do a lot of weight on a lat pull down. I liked it where I could do pretty good with my body weight in single leg squats, but I may not have been able to squat heavy weight. I was very strong relative to myself, relative to my body weight. My relative strength was elevated. That's like when there's a great example of that is the Arnold Classic used to have. I mean, Arnold Classic has not just bodybuilding, but he's got fencing. It's got all sorts of different sports that go on. And one of the booths that were set up were like, how many pull-ups can you do? Win a prize, whatever their booth was set up for. You can get free, whatever. Just how many pull-ups can you do? Well, they also had gymnastics. They had gymnastics at the Arnold Classic. And so it was strange. You see all these monster-sized men walking around, and you go by that board and you see Brittany and Kelly and Ginger and Penelope on the board, and you're like, man, these women are crushing it. Well, they were the gymnastics girls, and they were doing 30, 40 pull-ups, and the bodybuilder guys were like, I'm strong, but I can't do 30 pull-ups, because they are strong, but the relative strength of these small gymnastics participants far exceeded the bodybuilders in relative strength. So there, relative strength. I got a couple more for you. So one is autogenic and reciprocal inhibition. What's the difference? Autogenic inhibition is the mechanoreceptors within the same muscle that inhibit that muscle. So if I go into a stretch and my muscle spindles, when I stretch them out, they don't like it. You stretch too far and they contract, and they say, you've gone too far. In order for me to protect this muscle, I'm going to engage. And then after 30 seconds, usually, that muscle starts to relax. The Golgi tendon organ is the decision maker here. And it says, I feel a lot of tension, but I feel like we can let it go. Let it go. So they let it go, and that relax the muscle. And so that's the autogenic, because it is the mechanoreceptors within the same muscle that are creating the relaxation in that muscle, that, tiered, that degree of relaxation in the muscle. Reciprocal inhibition, on the other hand, is the muscle on the other side, the muscle that does the opposite joint action. So if I'm doing hamstring curls, my quads should not engage. I should not have my quads engage. But here's another thing. When I do a hamstring exercise, then I am effectively trying to get my quads to relax. That's one of the reasons I like bridges for for hip flexor stretches, active hip flexor stretch, because when you go up into a bridge, your hamstrings are working, your glutes are working, and they stretch your rectus femoris and they stretch your hip flexors. So I'm engaging my quads and my hamstrings, and I'm trying to get a relaxation response. I'm trying to get reciprocal inhibition in my rectus femoris and in my other main hip flexors, like my iliopsoas. So that's the difference between autogenic and reciprocal. Autogenic inside the same muscle, reciprocal in the reciprocal muscle, the one on the other side. All right, two more. Here we go. Two more pairs. I get this one a lot. This is a lot of times new people, but also people who have been at it for a while, and they go, I'm totally confused. I don't know why. Something's off. I can't remember which one is which. Frontal plane versus sagittal plane. And the reason why this can be very confusing is because frontal plane does not sound like you should be moving out to the side. And yet, that's exactly what that means. Movement in the frontal plane is side to side movement. So it's me doing a side bend. It is me doing a lateral raise. Now, if this also confusing, if I do a lateral raise with my shoulder and I do a front raise, the lateral raise is in the frontal plane and the front raise is in the sagittal plane, but the front raise is not in the frontal plane. Oh my gosh, did I just make everyone mad? Are we going nuts over here? Why? If I'm move my arms to the side. This is how I like to point it out. If you're looking at me, you're looking at the front of me. I'm standing there face to face with you, and I move my arms to the side. You see everything I do. You see my movement because you're standing in front of me. It is the point of vision where you see me. If you see me doing jumping jacks, I'm doing that in the frontal plane. Now, if I raise my arm in front of me and it blocks your vision of anything on my body, it probably is not in the frontal plane. So, also, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, this was initially the idea of planes were planes of dissection, not planes of motion. We move them into planes of motion so we can identify movement, but it was planes of dissection. If you wanted to see the front of somebody's brain, you would cut from one side of their head to the other, ear to ear, pull off the front of their head and be like, boop, that's what it looks like in the front of the brain. Didn't mean to get gross. Now I think about it, I'm saying it out loud. It sounds nasty and I'm sorry, but that's true. This is the truth. It's weird. People like Da Vinci trying to figure out how they can do Vitruvian Man and have all of these great, incredible drawings of the human body. You had to look at the human body. So frontal plane, you can see them from the front, which means I'm moving jumping jack style, side to side. Sagittal plane, think about Sagittarius. It is like a horse, right? Like a horse. When you think of a horse running, then pretty much front to back. They are very long front to back animals. They are sagittal based animals. So anything that goes front to back, up and down, front to back, then that movement is a sagittal movement, which is pretty much every movement we do. Our squatting, our lunging, our front raises, our crunching, those tend to be in the sagittal plane versus the frontal plane. All right, last one. These are big concepts right here. It's called Wolff's law and Davis's law. And Davis's law and Wolff's law are very similar, which is why they get confused. But Wolff's have to do with bones and Davis has to do with soft tissue. And they're both basically the same definition, except they're in two different things. Wolff's law, scientific explanation of how bones heal along the lines of stress. Davis's law, scientific explanation of how soft tissue models along lines of stress. So I always think about this, and I think about a wolf. A wolf will bite through bone. Don't get me wrong, they will also bite through soft tissue, but it's easier for me to think about like a wolf or a dog with a bone. And that helps me remember Wolff's law is about how the bones remodel versus Davis's law, which is how soft tissue remodels. And that means like if somebody breaks a bone or I put a lot of stress on a bone, then that bone will heal based off Wolff's law along that broken line of stress. Or if I stress an area of a bone, even if it's not broken, it gets thicker and thicker. I remember watching a show with little kids who were martial artists, and they were breaking bricks on their head. And they took like, this is the standard size of their skulls and the thickness of them versus other kids their age. And they were a lot thicker. Well, that would be Wolff's law, but that would also be bad parenting. So let's not do a lot of brick breaking children's heads. And then Davis's law is, you strain a muscle, you tear a muscle, then the Davis's law is the explanation of how soft tissue models along where that tear is. And then you have to be careful because you are not as strong where that tear is generally as a bone is, which might even be stronger than the other parts of the bone around it. But that's Wolff's law, bones, and Davis's law, soft tissue. Thank you. I hope you found it interesting. And, some of you maybe never heard of these things. So good. I'm glad you stuck it out for a vocabulary lesson. And for those of you who asked me questions about what's the difference, then I appreciate that. Please continue to ask those questions. Y'all can hit me up on my Instagram, DM me at dr.rickrichey or email me rick.richey@nasm.org and ask, hey, Rick, what's the difference between, and ask your question. Yo, thanks for being here. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. Keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.